on to Andy now. Andy, over to you.
I'm talking to you and I'm on mute, typical. Okay, that was an absolutely fantastic talk. And can you hear me now? Alison, thumbs up? Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we go from something on a seriously macro scale to something on a slightly smaller micro scale. And I'm sure some of you are wondering what fungi are doing in Climate Change Week. But I hope to show you just how important they are with respect to carbon within our ecosystems, and also with respect to our forests and in our environments in general. So, see if this works. Go on, here we go. So I'd just really like to start by reminding you that the soil is an amazing diversity. It's been called the poor man's rainforest because there's so much diversity in it. And fungi are just one component of this amazing array of diversity. And just to remind you what fungi are actually up to sometimes, they have very different trophic roles in the soil. Some are saprotrophs, breaking down organic material. Some are parasites, colonizing and affecting plants and animals. And what we're really focusing on tonight are the mutualists. And those are fungi which form beneficial associations with plants and animals. And really tonight we're talking about plants. And to give you some idea of how important these guys are, I'm going to take you right back in time, about 420 million years, to Rhynie. And Rhynie is a small village near Aberdeen. And this is a piece of Rhynie chert. And if you look inside the Rhynie chert, you can see these little fossils. And these little round or oval structures are in fact the stems of the very earliest vascular land plants. And by vascular, I mean they had an internal transport system. And these fossils are so beautifully preserved that you can do thin sections of them. You can polish them down, and you can get a very good idea of the early structures and the plants that were around during this period. And this is an artist's impression of what the area around Rhynie would have been like about 420 million years ago. Okay, so like I said, these are an artist's impression, but they have been generated because of these amazing fossils. And like I said, you can really pare them down and get an idea of the structures of the plants that were in this area. And they've done the reconstructions, and they're so beautifully preserved that you can actually see the roots and the cells of the roots. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that if you look inside these early cells, now these are images of fossils 420 million years ago. And those little structures you see are actually fungal structures inside the roots of these early land plants. Okay, now the reason why I'm mentioning it is because if you go and look inside the roots of plants today, you see exactly the same structures. And these were the ones today we know are symbiotic fungi, which colonize the plant roots, and they take up nutrients from the soil in return for carbon. And these very, very early land plants, the vascular land plants, had these same fungi associated with them. And we think fungi were absolutely crucial to the colonization of land by plants. Okay, so this has amazing implications for what has happened since. So in the intervening 420 million years, all of the ecosystems, all the terrestrial ecosystems that you see today have developed with that symbiosis in place. Okay, and we now know that these fungal root associations are ubiquitous, with over 90% of all land plants having these fungi associated with their roots. Okay, now this is really, really crucial because this is all based upon carbon and the transfer of nutrients between the soil taken up by the fungus, transferred to the plant in return for carbon. Okay, and this is what it's based on. Okay, here's a typical, what you might call a big plant, little plant experiment. This is Plantago lanceolata, and these two plants here, or the plants on the right-hand side. The ones on the right are grown with the fungus. The ones on the left are grown without the fungus in exactly the same conditions. Okay, and you can see this amazing impact that the fungi have on the growth of the plants. Without the fungi, the plants absolutely struggle. Okay, and Plantago is a great one for doing this with, because it's so dependent upon the fungi. Some plants are not as dependent. But of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The fungi are taking up the nutrients, passing them on to the plant, allowing the plants to grow. Okay, but the cost to the plant is between 10 and 30% of all the carbon that's fixed goes into the fungi. Now, you might think that's an amazing cost, but if it's a difference between growing and not growing, it's a good investment. Okay, so if you think about that, 10 to 30% of all the sugars which are produced by the plants end up in the mycorrhizal fungi. And that includes old Caledonian forests like this. We saw this, the Abernethy forest in the previous talk. Okay, all of these trees are dependent upon their mycorrhizal fungi for their nutrients. Almost all of the root tips will be colonized by the mycorrhizal fungi. And that applies to both old Caledonian forests like this, but also commercial forests. All of these trees, all of the plants, in fact, that you see in that picture are dependent upon the mycorrhizal fungi taking up nutrients from the soil, because the plants themselves are actually pretty useless at taking up nutrients. To show you what they actually look like, this is one of the quite a few types of mycorrhizal associations which are described, but these are the ones that are most important for tonight's talk with respect to our forests. These are called ectomycorrhizas, ecto meaning outside, and the mycorrhiza means fungus root, effectively. On the right-hand side there is a small pine seedling that we've colonized by a particular fungus, and it's growing out onto the peat substrate in this case. And everything white or cream that's on there is in fact fungus. Okay, the root system of the plant is actually pretty rudimentary. So the fungus is superbly adapted to grow out into the soil and take up nutrients and transfer them back to the plant in return for sugars. There's a close-up on the top left there of what the joint organ, the mycorrhizas, look like. And everything you can see there is in fact fungus, because it completely encloses the root of the plant, okay, which effectively isolates the feeder roots of the plant from the soil. The lower left there is a cross-section through one of these tips, and all of the purple material is the fungus forming this big mantle on the outside of the tip. Okay, everything inside that is plants, the large cells, or the small purple cells are in fact the fungus going in between the root cells. Okay, so that's the whole basis for this association. These fungi colonize the roots, grow out into the soil, absorb nutrients, and transfer some of them to the plant in return for sugars. So if you go out in the field and you pull up some of the organic material, you'll see it's absolutely full of very fine structures. These are the fungal hyphae. They're very fine. They're only about 5 microns across, but there might be 500 meters of them in each gram of soil, even up to 1 kilometer of this mycelium in the soil. Okay, so very, very abundant in the soil. If you take a bit of a closer look at the roots that you might have picked up, they're not nice, clean, white, shiny things like you see in textbooks. They are covered in fungi. Okay, all of these pictures are different species of fungi which have colonized the roots of some of our forest trees. Okay, different colors, different shapes, different amounts of mycelium being produced. They're all formed by different fungal species. And that's what reality is in the field, not some shiny white thing that the plant produces. Above ground, we know these fungi quite often as the fruit bodies you get in the autumn. The one on the top right, I'm sure, is familiar to everybody. That's the fly agaric. These are all the reproductive structures of the fungi which colonize our forest trees. Okay, so these are the reproductive structures. they grow above the surface, they drop the spores, which blow away in the wind, and hopefully land near a compatible plant. And the whole process starts again. So that whole idea of blowing away in the wind and landing near a compatible plant is really is really important where you get expansion of and regeneration of our woodlands onto moorlands, because the heather here forms one particular kind of association with fungi, whereas the trees in this picture, the birch, form something completely different. And if the birch is trying to colonize the moorland, both the seed and the spores of the fungi, or at least some mycelium of the fungus, has to be there in order for that tree to grow. Okay, so you need both partners. They're obligate symbionts. Neither can survive without the other. And this is really crucial when you're doing regeneration programs, like in the last talk. You need both partners here, because, as I said, the heather here forms a completely different association, and they actually maintain conditions that suppress other associations. So if you have a situation like this, I'll just show you what the roots of the erica or the calluna looks like. They're incredibly fine. They're called hair roots. You might have heard of root hairs. Well, these guys form hair roots, and they're incredibly fine, and they actually explore the soil, in this case, rather than the fungus. The picture on the left there shows one of these hair roots, and the pink structures within the cells are in fact the fungus, which has invaded the cells and completely filled the cell. And this is the mycorrhizal fungus, and you can see the fine filaments on the outside, which go out and take up nutrients, just exactly the same as the big ectomycorrhizas. And I mentioned that these guys actually maintain the conditions. Because they have been around when these plants evolved, this whole, the whole symbiosis has been here for all the development of all the ecosystems that we see. And the plants and fungi have evolved traits which best suit themselves. So they maintain the conditions here and effectively exclude other plant associations. And unless suitable fungi are available when you're putting trees out in moorland, the trees will probably not survive because they cannot break into the system. Okay, they need their own symbionts in order to grow. And it's really worth considering when doing regeneration programs. The other thing which has been in the news lately is putting trees onto moorlands does not necessarily mean greater sequestration of carbon. And that's something which is really important. Okay, the moorlands, as I said, they have their own set of traits, and it sequesters a lot of carbon in the ground. If you start introducing a different system, the ectomycorrhizal system, these fungi can actually access really old carbon, and they can mobilize that old carbon. And that can actually make the soil a source of CO2, not a sink. And this is something which is going to come up more and more, is what is the balance? Where is it correct to plant trees on organic soils? And this is going to come up more and more, I think. So just a couple of slides on the benefits of mycorrhizal fungi, because they really are what I would call pivotal organisms in forests. They're absolutely crucial for plant establishment, for nutrient and water uptake. And the establishment really depends upon the availability of suitable fungal inoculum. And I mentioned this in relation to the heather. Different mycorrhizal systems create the conditions most favorable to themselves. And if you try and change that system, it can have knock-on effects, which like the balance between sequestration and release of carbon. They not only take up nutrients, but they protect the plants against adverse abiotic and also biotic influences like pathogens. they interconnect plants together. This is something that you haven't really touched on, but the mycelium can connect different plants, different genera together. And they really are a major conduit for carbon going into the soil, okay? Between 10 and 30% of all the carbon fixed by the plant goes into the fungi. They're very sensitive to perturbations, particularly when it comes to nitrogen. And these fungi are major components of our forest biodiversity. In Scotland, we've got something like 1,000 species of fungi which can form ectomycorrhizas. And I'd just like to end on one other interesting fact about fungi and carbon. And that's a lump of coal on the left there. And we only have coal coming from the Carboniferous because the fungi that were around, and they've been around for 1 billion years, they hadn't yet evolved the enzymes necessary to break down the lignin. Once they did, those huge quantities of biomass that were being laid down, which turned into coal, started to be degraded by the fungi. And the end of the Carboniferous is spot on the time when we estimate that the fungi evolved these enzymes for breaking down lignin. Okay, so they've had a massive impact upon carbon cycling on the planet. Okay, thank you very much.
Wow, that was just so interesting. I find it fascinating, and how much the connections, the kind of communication channels that they can have as well between plants and trees. But anyway, there'll be time to ask questions later, and we're going to go